lot of you really seemed to enjoy my last video where I mashed up Spinosaurus and Indominus Rex, and boy did you give some great name suggestions for that hybrid. So for this video, I decided it's time to continue on drawing it, but this time I'm going to show off the rest of its body. G'day there folks, I'm Beanie, you're watching Beanie Draws, and if you're new here, I draw a lot of stuff like this, so consider hitting the subscribe button while you watch along. I originally drew this as just a head profile because I wanted to see if I could actually make a hybridization of Indominus Rex and Spinosaurus look good, and it turned out getting pretty popular both on here and on my Instagram, which you can find me at BeanArts. So I decided I wanted to try and draw the rest of the body, and to do this I wanted to focus a lot on Indominus Rex's claws and Spinosaurus' spine, naturally, and also wanted to see how it would look to have some of Indominus Rex's spikes running down Spinosaurus' back. Now as you can see, I kinda cheated a little bit by using the original line art from my head drawing and pasting that as the starting point for the body drawing. But for the whole body pose, I kind of thought that the mouth closed was a little bit boring, so I raised the jaw and I redrew it open instead. So essentially, using the original drawing more as a reference. And because I reduced the original head drawing down so I could fit in the rest of the body, the line weight didn't match the rest of the drawing, so I had to redraw most of it anyway so I could blend it in with the rest. And at this point, it was a matter of using shading to start building up the body's form, and using lines here and there to try and incorporate elements of the Indominus Rex's back with the Spinosaurus's back. Luckily, both have fairly crocodilian styled scales running along their backs, so it wasn't too difficult to find a nice balance between the two, while maintaining enough individuality so you could tell the difference between the two different dinosaur traits. So I was basically using a combination of different lines and shading to build up an impression of the creature, because sculptors don't typically go straight for the detail, nor do painters. They add layer upon layer of features to build up their creatures, so I add lines and shading throughout different areas to slowly build up my creations. And before I was talking about the spikes of the Indominus Rex and the spine of the Spinosaurus, and I figured I wanted to see what it'd look like with those spikes running along the sail of the Spinosaurus. Now with the way that I work, generally what happens is I'll be drawing one area and then I see an area that needs some more attention, like the hand, and this is one of those moments where I felt like I had to do a little bit more refinement in the hand area. And then we go back to scales again, and that's going to be a big theme in this one because there are a lot of scales. If I was going to draw each scale individually, it'd take forever to do, so as you can kind of see what I did in the sail here, I cheated a little bit by doing some horizontal lines and a few little vertical lines in between to make it sort of a mesh structure. So in some areas that don't need a high amount of detail, you can sort of impressionize the scales. I don't know if impressionize is a word, but we're sticking with that. And in some areas you can change up some of that mesh and put a few extra little scales in there for a little bit of detail, so you kind of pick which areas you want some more refined detail and which areas you can make a little bit more wrinkly. I mean, Stan Winston did this all the time with the T-Rex, put a lot of scales in the head and just kind of went with sort of more wrinkly lines throughout the body because you wouldn't pay that much attention to the body. And speaking of the body, now I'm going to go and show you even more of the detail of me scaling it. And as you can see by the super sped up process, it takes a very long time, but it's well worth it if you want to get that extra detail and realism. And moving back to the arm for a moment, you can see I'm using those rotational horizontal lines I like to sort of wrap around the arm for a little bit of texture but not going too overboard, and running skewed scales along its fingers. And then we go back to scaling. So much more scaling. Then refining the shape of the neck, adding a few folds here and there, adding a few quills from the Indominus Rex and the spikes from the Indominus Rex, and then even more scaling. To be honest, there's more time spent scaling a dinosaur than there is in actually drawing its shape. This shot's actually a good example where you can see where some of the small scales didn't actually line up with the bigger scales from the rest of the drawing because it was two different line weights, so I had to redraw some of the scales and redraw some of the shape just to kind of get it to line up with the rest of the body. And again, much like sculpting, you're always reshaping, adding lines, sometimes taking away some lines, adding details, removing some details. It's really a lot like sculpting, I think. Shame I'm not very good at sculpting. Although that's something I actually want to try doing, so let me know in the comments below if you'd like to see me actually try some sculpting. And now we're going back to even more detailing of the head, And I'm actually thinking, because I know this is rather quick, so I'm actually considering releasing a extended longer version so you can kind of watch and study how I do scales if you're so way inclined. Then we're going to move on to the teeth, which are pretty easy and straightforward. They're just basically curved triangles. Even more scales. Neck refining, so it looks more like an Indominus Rex. And then working on the feet and the hands, which are supposed to look mostly like Indominus Rex, because we had the Spinosaurus snout and sail, but I wanted to have the claws from the Indominus Rex and its feet. Looking back now, I kind of prefer how I originally drew the hands, so I'm not exactly sure why I redrew them, probably because I wanted more of a grasping nature and so you could see all of its claws. But I have this original footage, so I can go back to this and do a new drawing and use this as a reference for maybe a tutorial just on drawing the hand. And then pulling back out, looking at the whole image, I decided that the spikes running along its back, or the osteoderms, were a little bit too thick, so I raised them and restyled them to look more refined. And then of course, more scales. Lots and lots of scales. I wanted to go with broader crocodilian styled scales along its back and along its rump, and then thinner scales going along the spine. Also just refining scales, adding them along the shoulder, etc., where I found them necessary to add. And as I start to add more shading for depth and additional layers of detail, you'll start to notice which areas look a little bit plain and looking like they need more detail, and thus we begin working on the next leg. So as you can see, we have the rough basic form. Granted, it's not built out of circles like a normal tutorial would be, but you can see the toes, you can see the arching up of the toes to the heel, the ankle, and then the calf. And then essentially all you really need to do to make the foot look good is to run a series of skewed scales along each toe up until about the heel ankle area. I also pop a few on the back of the heel and the ankle, and I did have one commenter noticing that I forgot to add in a dew claw. Well, I guess mine doesn't have a dew claw. I'm pretty sure it'll survive without one. But overall, get the basic scales down, refine the shape of the leg and add a little bit more shading to one side, and you're well on your way to drawing dinosaur feet that look just like mine. And then guess what comes next? Yep, scales. More scales. So many more scales. Your journey in drawing scales will never end. But if you can accept that fact, you'll be well on your way to drawing epic detailed dinosaurs just like this one. Oh yeah, and dinosaurs had feathers too, so get used to drawing feathers as well. But at this stage, it almost looks finished. But we still need to work on the tail. Normally, if this were one of my proper tutorials, I would have already finished the line art for the main shape of the tail long before this stage, and then scaled it now. But again, this was all about experimenting to see how I could work with the different Spinosaurus and Indominus Rex features to get a good balance. So I left the tail for last. I was also starting to think that the sail was a little bit too Jurassic Park 3 styled, and actually made the whole dinosaur look a little bit small and a little bit front heavy, so I wanted to see how it would look by stretching out the sail and spreading it along the tail. I've seen a lot of recent paleo art with this longer style of sail along its back, and I really like how it looks, so I incorporated it into my hybrid. And because the tail was looking a little bit flat compared to the rest of it, I added a few more little bits of detail with the scales, added a little bit more shading and some shadow underneath just to blend it in and tie it in with the rest of the dinosaur. Then the last thing to do was colour. The Spinosaurus in Jurassic Park 3 has a lot of red in its head and sail and brown and whites along its body, but the Indominus Rex is mostly white, so to avoid too much of the Spinosaurus colouring from taking over, I kept it at just the red stripes running down its eyes, neck and back. Also, Spinosaurus from Jurassic Park 3 has a fairly distinct pattern along its spine, but because Indominus Rex has no real patterning, I muted and simplified the colouring down to just its basics. And while the Indominus Rex is a white dinosaur, nothing in life is a pure colour. Surfaces reflect light from the world around it, so I've noticed there's also a lot of blues and brown tones in its skin. And in the end, I think that the blues and the browns and the reds really complemented each other. Then I used some darker yellowy browns to act as a little bit of a shading to give the scales just that little bit of extra depth and detail. And I chose to go with the green eye colour of Spinosaurus's eye rather than the red, seems there was already Indominus Rex horn above its eye. But you could also go with a bit of red for a more demonic evil look. Then I added more colour textures and splashes splashes along the body, and after all that, I began to go over the scales with a light layer of white thin lines for highlights. I found that it adds a really nice extra level of detail, so I've been playing a lot more with that lately this year, and it's actually pretty simple to do. You just use some subtle white lines. Digitally it's obviously easiest, but you can also do this with a white paintbrush with a thin tip, or you could even use a white pencil, but I've found when doing it traditionally it's usually easier to work with a white paint. Either way, it adds a really nice subconscious level of depth. Then I wanted to fix some of the thickness in some of the spikes along its back and make the lines a little bit more uniform. And then one of the last things I'll touch on is the background. Traditionally you can go right ahead, but because this is digital, the Spinosaurus at the moment is actually transparent. And that's because the drawing app that I use on my iPad called Procreate is just like Photoshop in that it works in layers. So the drawing layer is actually on top of a white background layer. So as you're going to see now, if you want to draw in a background behind the Spinosaurus, and you want the Spinosaurus to still look white, you're actually going to have to draw in that white layer. So what I usually do is I make the background layer green, so it's really easy to see what areas aren't white, and then in between the green layer and the drawing layer, I draw my white. Boom. Then all you gotta do is play around with the multitude of different brushes that Procreate or whatever drawing app or traditional methods that you've got to deal with provide, give it some final detail tweaks, and then bask in the glory of your hybrid creation. So this video actually ended up being a little longer than I thought it would. I was only planning it to be about 3 minutes, but I wanted to go into a bit of detail on how I went about creating it and explaining some of the things here and there. So if you liked it, give it a big old thumbs up, let me know what you thought. I also have another Spinosaurus hybrid that I'm about to release. Let me know in the comments below if you know what that is. I'll give you a hint. It's on my Instagram at beanarts. So if you don't want to miss that video or any of my future videos, I highly recommend that you subscribe and hit the bell notification so YouTube actually notifies you when I upload those videos. But don't go just yet, because I've got 2 other videos that you can watch right now. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in my next video. Cheerio for now.